Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Actually, you didn't see me there. You know why? Because I've got camouflage on. That's right, today we are talking about camouflage, the history of camouflage, why it has such a dumb name. It's the French, spoiler alert. And we're going to be doing a little testing, not in the snow actually. We just filmed it before there was snow. And we're going to be going over, why they didn't use camouflage for a lot of human history, or organized military history, I should say. Why we started using it and the different types that we used specifically in the United States. So before we get into all that, of course, just remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on the other social media, Instagram and Twitter X, and let's just get right into it. So, of course, what I'm wearing here is camouflage. I have what is now standard issue in the Army for my top, and then just kind of a commercial hat, boonie hat. Believe it or not, the US Army didn't actually have standard issue camis for everyone until 1981, which seems like a long time, and you think, why aren't they hiding themselves before then? Just getting into the history of camouflage real quick, right? So camouflage is the French word that kind of means to like hide or conceal. And there's a few different types of camouflage, but for today we're kind of looking at two main different types, which is mimesis and disruptive camouflage. Mimesis pretty much just means you're trying to blend in and look like stuff in your environment. So a classic example for military application would be like a ghillie suit, right? Or if you, for hunters, a lot of times they'll have just kind of like the print that looks like actual leaves and stuff like that. In nature, you can think of like, a barred owl or a stick bug or something like that. And it can incorporate shape as well as just color. And then there's also disruptive camouflage, which doesn't necessarily look like the background or your environment, but what it does do is it just kind of breaks your shape up enough so you don't kind of look like anything in particular. Right, so a lot of camouflage nowadays is kind of disruptive. If you think like a leopard's spots or something, that actually hides the leopard pretty well. Tiger is sort of similar, but it doesn't really look like the nature. It just makes it not look like a single animal, right? And in terms of, hiding, people have kind of been doing that forever, right? We're predators. We need to get close to our prey in order to kill them oftentimes. And so people would, use camouflage of varying degrees, especially when hunting, and of course that translates to warfare. And, for the vast majority of human history, it was kind of small hunter-gatherer bands that were going off and kind of fighting each other. And so camouflage would be useful in a lot of those situations because you want to sneak up, get close to the enemy camp without being spotted, and then take their stuff, kill anyone that gets in your way, and then leave. And that's kind of how war was for most of human history. Right? But then when we get into the kind of, larger scale battles, and, just thinking hundreds of guys in a field fighting each other, two different sides, right? Kind of when we think of war for most of human history in Europe and China, India, Middle East, Persia, wherever. That's kind of just a common thing that you see in areas with high population densities. And they, of course, were not using camouflage. And why? Well, the reason is just the way that they fought, right? So pretty much when you're thinking of why camouflage came in and out of style, you have to think about the technology of the time, especially the weapons technology and the communications technology, because that determines how people fight, and then that, of course, determines whether or not you would need camo to do that fighting, right? So on the communications front, of course, people did not have radios and telegrams for a long period of human history. So if you were a commander of a battlefield, you had to be able to be relatively close to the people around you in order to give orders. And to add to that, especially when you got into bigger army units, is you essentially had to have some way of communication, usually through instruments like a bugle or a horn or a drum, and that would give people orders on what to do, since it's hard to give like a detailed verbal order in a loud, chaotic battlefield, right? And at the same time, people would also tend to have standards, so just a big stick with kind of a flag on it, so people knew which, group was theirs, which group wasn't theirs, especially at a distance. It may kind of be hard to tell, especially before uniforms were a thing. And then, being able to distinguish, hey, I want X group to do a flank or Y group to push forward or retreat, and it just kind of made that whole process of communication and command easier. And of course, on the military front, when you think of the weapons available for the vast majority of human history, or I should say the vast majority of, organized warfare in human history, weapons just don't have a lot of firepower or a lot of range, meaning you're going to have to get close to the enemy to actually engage with them, right? If you think most bows through human history, kind of at max, are hitting a couple 100 yards away. And even then, especially when armor starts happening, you have to get even closer than that, within 100 yards usually, to actually be able to do damage against the armor. And then, of course, with melee weapons, spears being the most common weapon for all of human history, you have to get pretty close, even if it's a throwing spear, right? At the same time, those weapons don't have a lot of firepower, meaning essentially a small group or a single person or warrior can't do that much damage against a lot of other people with their weapon, right? It's kind of refined to one-on-one. You're not able to take on a whole bunch of different people at once with any kind of given weapon that exists at the time. And what that really means is all these things combine, both communication and weapons tech, where people have to get close to fight. You have to have lots of people to fight, because again, you kind of have to match them one for one. You're not going to have a lot of firepower per se, and you're not going to be able to communicate at long distance and have kind of decentralized command, right? So very centralized command, and essentially guys fighting in a field at close range, and when you're that close, you can't even hide. So what's the point of camouflage? And even if you could hide, you couldn't do a whole lot of damage, right? Because a few guys in the woods can't do that much damage with the bows and spears of the eras, and you wouldn't be able to communicate and coordinate with a larger group of people, so it doesn't make sense that you'd be hiding off in the woods and not even your commander knows where you are. And this kind of only continues and solidifies through the early modern era, where since states are getting richer, armies are getting larger, and they're also able to have standing armies, which means they're able to equip them, which means you also have uniforms. So standardized uniforms. So the classic example is the red coat, right? The British red coat. So, that's the opposite of camouflage. It's very easy to see where they are. And again, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, camouflage and kind of asymmetric warfare always exists through this period, right? I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's not how the main damage is done with mainline militaries, right? Again, Julius Caesar was painting his ships blue. Roger's Rangers in the 7 Years' War fighting for the English were using green uniforms to try and hide, and they were doing hit-and-run attacks. Native Americans, there was lots of kind of, more asymmetric warfare going on that kind of exists through this whole period, even though it's not the main thing. But by the late 1800s, and really you start seeing this in the early 1900s, because of late 1800s trends, the scales start to shift and it becomes useful to be able to hide again, right? Because essentially the weapons technology and the communications technology has become far more effective, right? So communications, you have telegrams, makes it so that now generals don't have to actually see everything in the field to be able to communicate and command what's going on, right? Usually now generals are not even close to the fighting. So that kind of starts to decentralize the command, and it happens differently for different countries. The Germans are kind of at the forefront of this. And when we think of kind of the fire squad, or, kind of a group of 10-ish guys who are more or less making their own calls, to fix fire, close, all that. And the Marine Corps, of course, does this now too. It's now a very common thing in Western armies especially. But it kind of starts with the Germans sort of almost in the mid to late 1800s all the way, and it kind of reaches its modern form in World War I. At the same time, you also have this massive jump in weapons technology, right? So the basic thing of it is that weapons are more accurate and have longer range, and they have far more firepower. And pretty much what that means is a handful of guys can do a lot of damage to a lot of people at hundreds of yards away relatively accurately, right? You couldn't do that with a bow, you couldn't do that with a musket, but you can do that with a machine gun, right? And so what that means is it actually makes sense to be able to hide not only from the enemy trying to hit you at hundreds of yards away, because you can hide hundreds of yards away. You also have to disperse your formations, so you can't just have a bunch of dudes all in a field walking towards the enemy because they'll just get mowed down. That happens a lot in the beginning of World War I, actually, and there's kind of this evolution to shift the tactics into trench warfare and later kind of into a maneuver warfare. And on the offensive, it actually makes sense that you can send a small group of guys to do a whole bunch of damage. Right? The German stormtroopers are the best example. Gurkhas for the English are another example of that as well. So it starts to become more and more profitable to have smaller groups of people. And again, smaller groups kind of doing spec ops had always existed, but it wasn't the main thing. And it still wouldn't be in World War I, but it starts to develop as a bigger and bigger thing. So it pretty much makes it where you can have less guys because you can't hide thousands of people in the woods, right? But you can hide 40-ish people in the woods, you could hide a platoon, you can hide a fire squad in the woods, no problem. And so it actually makes sense that they can try to hide. And that smaller group can do more damage and they don't have to get as close, so they have a better chance of hiding, if that all makes sense, right? So that's when you start to see this development of kind of more concealed clothing. And the Germans already had this before World War I. They were wearing these gray uniforms. The French, of course, did not catch on in time. They were wearing blues, and they also had these bright red pants, which made them very visible even from a long distance. So for machine gunners, for snipers, any troop that was kind of caught out in the open, you're going to get spotted very quickly, and that's it. Whereas the Germans had a better chance of, you know, being able to be in no man's land, work on wire at night, do some scouting, and they're not going to get just lit up immediately because they can hide a little bit better. And of course, the stormtroopers who are crawling all the way to the enemy trench are not going to get found out in the same way. So by the end of World War I, you essentially have, you know, everyone now is wearing some sort of dreary color to kind of blend in. Usually a tan or a beige or a gray, sometimes even a greenish color. And that becomes common, and that's pretty standard for most of kind of the modern era through the 20th century. And then around the 70s and 80s, that's when you start to see militaries fully issuing out kind of full-on camouflage, right? Now, if we kind of hone in on the US for a second, just because it's different for every country, but it's sort of a similar development for every country. Through, you know, even the Vietnam War, the US did not issue standard camo, right? Now, camo existed. Camo existed, you know, even in World War I, actually. This is not a World War I helmet. It's actually like a Yugoslav helmet, but we had a World War I project where we painted it like World War I Dazzle camo, and this is actually what a lot of camo in World War I looked like. And you think, this looks really obvious, right? And to some degree, you're right. There's a reason people stopped using this. But it works better than you'd expect, especially at longer ranges, because something that is interesting with camouflage is there's sort of this duality with how you can make your designs, right? Because if your patterns and shapes are too small, then at a long range, you actually start to get this effect called isoluminance, especially, and it depends on the color palettes you use as well. But isoluminance is pretty much where a smaller pattern at range starts to just look like a single blob, right? And now it's no longer kind of working well as a camouflage, it just kind of looks like a single pastel color out there. So to actually defeat that, what you need is a larger shape, right? So you look at the shapes on this thing, they are quite large, and at close range it's very obvious, but at longer ranges, and long range I'm talking 50 plus yards, right? That's not really long range by like weapon standards. But this actually looks kind of natural, and we can see, I'll pop up a clip right here. Like it's hard to find, especially even just at like, you know, 15 yards if you have it in the right background. So this stuff actually does work to some degree, not as well as other versions, of course. They used it on ships and stuff as well, which ended up not working just because, you know, that's a whole other thing. Essentially, it tried to confuse the distance and direction rather than the actual shape of the ship. And it didn't work because there was other instruments to tell how far away the ship is and all that. Anyways, camouflage still exists through this time. It's just not the norm, right? So the norm is this drab color, not what I'm wearing. So the norm is just like a drab color. And then some people had camouflage, especially special forces. Think stormtroopers. The German SS was using kind of a Flecktarn during World War II. During Vietnam, you know, the Navy SEALs had their tiger stripe camo, their ERDL, which kind of looks like a woodland. We'll get to that in a second. But by the 80s, late 70s, really, the US was like, you know what? Everyone should have camo. And they do some testing, and in 1981, they come out with the M81, also known as the Woodland camo. So this is the Woodland camo. This is, you know, the quintessential famous camouflage that exists for, you know, everything, right? When you think of camouflage, this is what it is. And so the Army, I believe, first gets this, and then the other branches of the US military also adopt it. And this lasts for quite some time, right? So it's kind of the standard issue for everyone until the 2000s, really. Now, that being said, there were other camouflages as well, especially for desert environments. If you think, you know, the 90s, you have Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu, you have the Gulf War. That all takes place in desert environments, so they're not going to be wearing this. And they have desert camos instead, and that's kind of what we think of when we think of the US military in the 90s. Now, if we're talking about types of camouflage, this is more of a disruptive type. Again, it doesn't really look like, you know, things in nature necessarily. It kind of looks like a nothing at all, and we have some footage of it right here, and we'll kind of go over it in a little bit. It depends on the environment you're in, of course, but I thought it kind of underperformed a little bit, and we'll get into that in a minute. So anyway, the Marine Corps agreed that this tends to underperform sometimes, and they wanted something else that was cooler. And they found their answer actually up north with the Canadians. So the Canadians in 96, made this thing called CAD-PAT. And it was a digital camouflage, which essentially tries to do a best of both worlds thing, like where we talked with earlier, where you have the sort of isoluminance versus kind of the big conspicuous shapes, and how to avoid the pitfalls of either. Digital camo tries to work well at longer range and at close range. The Canadians had started using this. The Marine Corps said, you know, this is actually a great idea, and they tweaked some of the colors, but more or less kind of took the pattern, and it's, you know, they say they didn't, but they probably did. And in 2001, 2002, they issue out Marpat, or Marine pattern. And that's what you see here. You can see it's a more digital kind of pattern. Now, that's what the Marines start using, and by 2004, you know, the US, of course, the global war on terror starts. The US decides, hey, we have our old desert camo and we have woodland. None of those really work amazingly. So how about we try to change our camo as well? And they also went in the digital direction, and they went with something called UCP in 2004. Now, this is UCP. It's a plate carrier. I'm not going to put it on because I have my mic on. You can see it is kind of a grayish beige color. And the idea, UCP, universal camouflage, right, is it's supposed to work in all the environments. And their logic is, when we tested a whole bunch of different camos, grays and tans were the ones that tended to do the best. Or at least grays and tans were in every successful camo. And so they thought, let's make a camo out of grays and tans. Turns out, it really suffers from this isoluminance issue, so at long range it looks like a blob, and it just didn't really look like anything even with its color palette. So they ended up kind of just getting rid of it pretty quickly, and actually they started looking for a replacement, and by 2015 they came with OCP, or Occupational Camouflage Pattern, which is what I've been wearing this whole time. So OCP is what I'm wearing right here. It kind of uses sort of the natural-ish looking shapes of, you know, a woodland, but they're much smaller. It's a more diverse color palette than either of the two. Personally, I think it works the best, and we'll talk about that in a little bit again. But by 2015, they settled on this, and it's kind of a complicated process how they got that. There's some great videos online. Camo History is a good one. I'll put some other videos in the description, but pretty much, long story short, this was invented way back. It was competing with UCP. It was made by Cry Precision. It was called Multicam, and they tried to run this. Then in 2015, they decided, okay, let's go with Cry instead of UCP. And that ends up not working out because Cry wants a little extra money. The government's trying to kind of jip them on that, and then they find like kind of a slightly altered version of Multicam and end up running with that by 2015. And that's what this is. So kind of the main difference between this and real multicam or original multicam, which went commercial before it was used by the military, is real multicam has kind of more vertical elements, like little twig looking things. And it's kind of a browner background color instead of a greener one. And that's pretty much the history of why camouflage existed and didn't exist, and then how the US has evolved it in its use. And since then, of course, you know, there's been a bazillion different types of camo. Americana Pipe Dream's a great place to buy these things. You know, lots of camos have been based off of the Woodland thing, both legally and illegally. Multicam's been very popular in lots of militaries recently. Personally, I think the Swedish camo, I forget the name of it right now, I think that's like the coolest one, but that's just me. And of course, you know, when it comes to the winter, there's a whole other issue of, you know, how should you camouflage for that? Solid white versus kind of mixed coloration. We're not going to get too much into it. That being said, I do have kind of an alternative camo right here. I'll put some pictures up for you. This is actually a thing by Phantom Leaf. I forget the pattern name off the top of my head, so I'll put it out there for you. It's kind of more of a mimesis thing and not so much a disruptive style. I was wearing it for most of the tests when I was testing OCP. I think it works pretty well. Speaking of tests, let's talk about the tests. So pretty much, so to start, we essentially tried to set a baseline and try to figure out how effective is camo compared to just, you know, brown or green clothes, right? And so we have some right here. We did not get enough testing, I have to admit. I wish we did a little more. And it also, keep in mind, what shows up on the camera will always be a little different than what you see in real life. But you can see, depending on how you hide yourself, the colors actually can work pretty well, especially if there's stuff in between you and the person looking at you. And the other thing that's cool with camo is it's once you see it, you can't unsee it kind of thing, right? So when we were testing, we knew where the other person was, and we tried to kind of not focus on them in the footage so that you guys at home could try to, you know, kind of find us, or like a Where's Waldo thing. But looking back at the footage, I was pleasantly surprised because it's always harder to see someone once you don't know immediately where they are already. Now, in terms of how good the camos were, so let's start camo versus no camo. Definitely camo worked way better. Now, going in chronological order, Woodland. I feel like Woodland did the worst, but also keep in mind, it totally depends where you are and even what time of season, right? So we are kind of northeastern US, we have lots of pine trees, we have lots of oaks and beaches and stuff like that, and we were filming in December, would normally be greener, so we would have more you know, leaves on shrubs and ferns and stuff like that. And I feel like that was the issue with the Woodland. It would work better in a greener area. But even here, when it is greener, a lot of the environment is still mostly brown. So I still feel like it was the worst. And we tried to also film at kind of close range and short range just to kind of show it can make a difference. And it also definitely makes a difference when you're kind of hiding behind something versus not hiding behind something. Then when we go to Marpat, I feel like Marpat also did decent. I feel like it was a bit dark for where we are. So, you know, maybe if we had more forest cover or if it was later in the day, that would have worked better, I feel like. There were some very impressive moments with it, but I feel like it wasn't quite as good. Then we have UCP. UCP, we just had the chest rig, so we didn't test it to its full capacity. We were surprised how good it was, just because it has this reputation of being really bad, but it's actually far and away the brightest of all the camos, and it seemed like the main trend was the camos were too dark for the area we were in. So that actually worked okay, but also it was going over OCP, right? And I think OCP performed the best here. But again, that's just because of where we are. It's a bit brighter than the other two camos. And I feel like it kind of does the best at being able to hide kind of in a greener area and also kind of in like a light brown kind of underbrush area, or, you know, just on the ground. Whereas Marpat is going to be better with the more thickly wooded areas. Woodland's going to be good with an area with lots of green underbrush. UCP might be decent in like a barren area, right? But I feel like for where we live right now, this is number one, OCP. So that's my personal preference. This is not going to be a whole thing of, oh, you know, your 7S is a camouflage and all that. That can be important, and you see it here, right? Camo's not going to help you that much if you're not trying to hide. You see these videos of us walking. It's still very obvious, right? Camo's not going to hide you when you're moving very well. But if you are actually hiding, camo will do a lot for you. right? Especially, again, when someone doesn't know exactly where to look, and if there's something in between you and the other person, and you're not like, you know, standing up like, hello, I'm a person, you can hide a lot better, and I feel like that's kind of the thing. If for whatever reason, you know, you want camouflage, you know, hunting has its own things because of, you know, blinds, and some animals are colorblind. But in terms of kind of like military style camo, I mean, it's just fun, right? If you do airsoft, if you do anything kind of in the woods where you want to hide from other people, camouflage absolutely works, I think. That being said, sometimes it can be like just too expensive. It doesn't feel like it needs to be that expensive. At least the clothing is generally pretty durable, so it's not gonna like break on you right away. So even if you're paying 50, 60 bucks for a jacket like this, you can still get them cheaper than that as well. But even if you are paying kind of like a full price, it's gonna last you a very long time. So yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, hit the subscribe button, all that fun stuff. I will see you in the next one. Have a great day. Goodbye.